So how important is this true crime genre to help police solve cold cases? Joining us now, NewsNation legal contributor Sara Azari. So Sara, what do these shows do that police departments can at times?
Good to be with you, Kelly. You know, I think it's a tremendous role that media plays, online sleuths, podcasts, documentaries, all of it, because it's about resources. You know, part of the frustration for victims and family of victims of individuals who go missing is that they file a missing person report with law enforcement. There's some preliminary steps taken, but at some point it just sits in a database. And unless there is some evidence of something nefarious, of some sort of, some suspicion of a crime, it never gets to the hands of a detective who then opens up an investigation. I think this reminds me of in 2018, Adea Shabani, when she went missing. I actually talked about that case a lot with Ashley Banfield, who was at HLN at the time. And but for the fact that there was a podcast, To Live and Die in LA, that was real time, working with a personal investigator that the family had hired, law enforcement would have never gotten to the point of discovering her body. Unfortunately, that was not a happy ending, but they were they were able to bring closure for this family in a pretty swift manner. So they play a tremendous role because it's an investigative tool that gives manpower and resources that law enforcement otherwise doesn't have.
Well, certainly, and to piggyback off that, we saw in Rich's report how a tip from a viewer of Unsolved Mysteries led to the discovery of Kayla. But is there a danger that these shows may lead to hundreds of tips or thousands that lead nowhere, causing police to spend valuable time chasing bad leads?
Well, I think the police should be thankful and look at this as a gift, right? It's better to have 200 leads that lead nowhere, and at least you have the leads, than to have no leads or a dozen leads. I think the danger that I see in the role that the media plays is more in cases like Koberger or Alec Murdaugh, where essentially the accused's rights are at issue, and media gets them convicted in the court of public opinion before they can get a fair trial, before they can be presumed innocent. So I think the danger to me is on that side with respect to the accused and not so much with respect to the victims. I think this is very helpful to law enforcement and to families of victims to find missing people. You know, the other thing I want to say, Kelly, is that people go missing. Something like 600,000+ people go missing a year in the United States in a year. And it's not always for nefarious reasons. You know, sometimes they walk off on their own, they come back. Sometimes it's, they're found. And in this case, it was very rare. It was after 6 years. But so again, we're dealing with limited resources. And I think when you're thinking about justice and the role that this plays in the criminal justice system and in cases, it's not one-sided. It's about the victims and getting closure for their families, of course, and bringing them home safe. But it's also about the accused and their right to a fair trial.
Well, I think that's a really important point to bring up, and I appreciate you doing it. As you know, Sara, the podcast Serial, this is another example. It brought global attention to the case of Adnan Syed, whose murder conviction is now on hold after prosecutors reviewed the case, arguably due to the podcast. So as a defense attorney, do you feel these shows wield more power than what a legal team can bring to the court at times?
I definitely think, and I don't know this firsthand, but I can only imagine, because I followed that podcast and the case, the appeal, pretty closely. I can almost be certain that the defense team for Syed relied on a lot of the materials that were uncovered on that podcast. So this is one of the rare instances where we see somebody who's wrongfully convicted get justice from media, from a podcast. And I think, I look at a wrongfully convicted person. I'm a defense attorney, but I think also any reasonable person would think that somebody who's wrongfully convicted is also a victim. Victim of bad evidence, victim of misconduct, victim of jury confusion, victim of whatever the system does sometimes, And so that was a wonderful result to see that after so many years, his conviction was overturned. I mean, now there's a little glitch with respect to the victims not having been heard, but his conviction remains overturned, and that was really largely because of Serial bringing so much attention to that case and really getting the attention of the prosecutors and law enforcement to revisit that case.
Yeah, it was fascinating. So digital sleuths, as you know, it's a growing trend. We see them very active in cases like Alec Murdaugh, Bryan Kohberger. And you mentioned some of the dangers being that you're convicting somebody even before a trial. Are there other dangers that concern you?
I mean, really, that's the biggest one to me. I'm a defense attorney. I think, you know, the fact that somebody is presumed innocent is going completely just, I mean, that it's more of an assumption of guilt as opposed to a presumption of innocence at this point, especially with those two that you just mentioned, because there's nowhere in the United States that Murdaugh could have gotten a fair trial, and same goes with Kohberger. But I think one point I want to make is it's also interesting that in cases like Robert Durst, who was convicted and then died after his sentencing shortly thereafter, media, or that HBO documentary, The Jinx, actually became evidence against him. So part of his role in that documentary was essentially admitted against him. So that also sometimes happens.
Thank you for watching. Go to newsnationnow.com to find NewsNation on your television provider. And don't forget to click the red subscribe button below to get more of NewsNation's fact-driven, unbiased coverage.